Welcome into Texans Today. I'm your host, Jeremy Chuggs, and coming up on the show today, players the Texans should target in the trenches. We're talking the big boys, O-line, D-line at the start of NFL free agency, and along with that, I'm going to be breaking down some of the moves that we've already seen because the NFL, the offseason, it's already begun. There's already wheels moving. There are moves being made by other teams. I'm going to break those moves down and how that impacts the Texans going forward to start free agency. Before we get into all of that, though, we are on that road to 30,000 subscribers. Thank you to everybody so far who's hit that sub button. I told y'all, we get 30,000 subscribers by the NFL draft. I will be going live for the biggest moves being made by the Texans on draft day, their picks. I'll be giving live reactions, some live mailbags, but you got to help me out. It's 100% free to hit that subscribe button. And hey, my plea to you is that give me 1 week to show you how great this channel is. If you don't like it in a week, hit that unsubscribe button, but let me prove to you my dedication to the Houston Texans. And if you haven't already checked out my video that dropped yesterday, some free agency rumors. ESPN linked the Texans to Drew Dahlman, the #1 center in NFL free agency. I was going to talk about him on today's show as well, but I just didn't want to beat a dead horse and talk about him 2 days in a row. But if you want to know my thoughts on Drew Dahlman and the Texans possibly going out and getting him in free agency, go check out this video. That link is going to be in the comments and description of today's video. Before we get going on today's show as well, let's break down some of the moves that have already happened around the NFL. Jonah Jackson, he was one of my top targets for the Texans to look at in NFL free agency or via a trade. He already got traded to the Chicago Bears, along with Joe Thuney, formerly of the Kansas City Chiefs. Both those guys going to be the starting guards for the Chicago Bears, where they turned their biggest weakness this past season maybe to one of their bigger strengths, looking to protect Caleb Williams. Hey, Nick Caserio, maybe we can do the same thing for our guy in C.J. Stroud. Another move already being made, and this was one of the first moves to be made. Trey Smith, he was tagged by the Kansas City Chiefs, and that took off the best guard, the best interior offensive lineman in NFL free agency off the rip. So he is out of the question for teams, which means there's a lot of different offensive line targets to look at now. And it makes it where some of those middle tier guys, some of those middle of the road free agents, their evaluations are going to get bumped up. Hell, we even saw, we're not talking wide receivers in this video, but Tutu Atwell got signed for $10 million. There's going to be guys who get paid a lot more than what you think and a lot less than what you think during this free agent period. So now, let's look at some offensive line targets to start free agency for the Houston Texans. Let's look at some guys that could be, fits for Nick Caserio to help out the trenches down in Houston. First, let's talk about Aaron Banks. Could Banks be cashing in this offseason? The 27-year-old now has quickly become one of the top interior offensive line targets in the National Football League. And, originally Spotrac was like, maybe like 10 to 12 million. The latest reports coming out is that he's actually going to make closer to $20 million per year in NFL free agency. Our guy who actually hosts the 49ers show here at Chat Sports, Chase Sr., he was breaking it down on his channel and talking about, I don't know if Aaron Banks is worth that $18 to $20 million a year price tag. As we look at his PFF numbers from this past season, all somewhat, middle of the road. And I'll say it again, PFF isn't the end-all, be-all, but I feel like for offensive and defensive line, they do a pretty good job of highlighting which guys are playing the best. Aaron Banks, middle of the pack guard in the NFL. He is 27, though, so that age is going to play a factor. And the scheme fit. Plays for the 49ers for the start of his career. Obviously, the Texans offense is modeled somewhat off of that 49ers and now Rams offenses in the West Coast. Could Aaron Banks be a fit for the Houston Texans? But that $18 to $20 million a year price tag really got me thinking. What will Houston spend on more during this free agency period? Do you think it's going to be O-line or do you think it's going to be wide receiver? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section. If you get hit with the YouTube ad break here, perfect timing. Scroll on down and give me your thoughts. What do you think the Texans will spend most of their money on this offseason? Even though O-line might be a bigger need for the Houston Texans, I actually think they're going to spend more money at the wide receiver position this offseason. The reason of that, and shout out to Garrett, you might know him on Twitter as Houston Stressens. He actually highlighted this in a recent article where the Texans actually have the second most spending of any NFL team at the offensive line spot. Nearly 30% of their cap is dedicated towards the offensive line. So, with that being said, are they going to go out and sign more high-profile guys at the offensive line? I don't necessarily think so. There are obviously moves to be made. You can cut Shaq Mason. You can move on from a couple different guys along the front five. But at the end of the day, I think the Texans are going to spend more money at the receiver spot than they will at offensive line. And to go with that, my free agency options for the Texans, these next guys are going to be more of the low profile guys, the cheaper, on the cheaper side, that I think that could fit with the Texans. First, Isaiah Wynn didn't really play at all last year, 3 games played, but he has multiple connections, and that's something that you got to look at in free agency is those connections to the front office. Was drafted in New England, where Nick Caserio was before the Houston Texans, and then played for the Dolphins, where that Mike McDaniel scheme is very similar to what the Texans run down in Houston. So that fit with Isaiah Wynn to come over to the Texans. Obviously was injured last year. You could possibly get him on a very cheap deal. This is an intriguing name that you got to look out for if you are a Houston Texans fan. One of my favorite options at the guard spot in free agency, James Daniels. Now, he's coming off of a torn Achilles that he suffered in late September of last year, but at age 27, I think he should be good to go for the start of this NFL season. Before he was injured, was the second-ranked guard by PFF amongst all offensive guards in the NFL. He's got a lot of talent, and he's still young. Like I said, 27 years old. James Daniels is one of my favorite options for the Texans left in free agency at the guard spot. Another popular name that has been floated around, Kevin Zeitler. The problem is he's 34 years old. So this is a signing that you would get at a 1 or 2 year, stopgap option. Maybe draft another, offensive guard in round 2, 3, or 4 to go along with this move to kind of get somebody waiting in the wings, because he's only got about, 1, 2, maybe 3 years left in the NFL. Maybe he, defies father time like a couple other guys, maybe playing into his 40s, but I think that's a little less likely. I think he's got 1 or 2 really good years left in him. Another option for the Texans, Patrick Mekari from the Baltimore Ravens. He's 27 years old, and he brings that big V. Versatility. He's played all along the offensive line. He's played at both tackle spots, guard, center. He has been everywhere for the Baltimore Ravens. And the Texans want an emphasis on the run game this coming season with Nick Caley at OC. He is a pretty good run blocker. They do really good They do a really good job there up in Baltimore, run blocking. He could be another sneaky option for the Texans, even though I think his price tag is actually getting a little bit more inflated because teams see him as a tackle, and usually the offensive tackles get paid more than the offensive guards. So I could see his value sneakily creeping up there close to like that Aaron Banks of like $17, $18, $20 million a year. Now, my last option for the Texans at the offensive line spot, not my last option, but the last one I'm going to talk about on today's video, Ryan Kelly, 31 years old, played with the Indianapolis Colts, is a good center option. I don't know how the Texans feel about Jarrett Patterson and Juice Scruggs at center, but if they're not comfortable with those guys, Ryan Kelly could be a decent option from a division rival, so you're stealing somebody away from the Colts, knows the AFC South, would be a decent option for the Texans to look at if they really want to upgrade the center position. Now, coming up next, I'm going to look at the defensive line, and I'm actually going to segment it out in 2 spots. I'm going to look at defensive tackle, and then I'm also going to look at edge, because obviously the Texans have good edge rushers. They have Danielle Hunter, they have Will Anderson Jr., but they might need some depth there at the edge spot. I'll look at defensive tackle, which is a bigger need in my opinion, and then I'll look at some sneaky edge options for the Texans as well. Before we get into those, though, got to shout out our sponsor of today's program, and that is Factor Meals. It helps me get fed and make sure I stay on my diet and stay healthy. That's how you do it with our friends over at Factor Meals. Ready to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor has chef-made gourmet meals that make eating well easy. They're dietitian approved, ready to heat and eat in 2 minutes, so you can fuel right and feel great no matter what life throws at you. Factor arrives fresh and fully prepared, perfect for any active, busy lifestyle. The best part, no dishes. You don't have to worry about cleaning up for 30 minutes after you eat. That's one of my favorite parts about Factor. You can also lose up to 8 pounds in 8 weeks with the Factor Keto Meals. Based on a randomized controlled clinical trial with Factor Keto, results will vary depending on diet and exercise. But not only keto, if you're looking for other dietary preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, they have 40 options across 8 different dietary preferences on their menu every single week. So whatever you're feeling, they got for you over at Factor Meals. Reach your goals this year with ingredients you can trust and convenience that cannot be beat. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/factorpodcast and use code FACTORPODCAST to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code Factor Podcast at factormeals.com/factorpodcast. Get 50% off that first box plus free shipping. Go check them out today, our friends over at Factor. Now, talking about the defensive tackles, the first thing you got to mention with the Texans and the defensive tackles is their own free agents that they have. I've been talking a lot about Mario Edwards Jr. and Foley Fatukasi, and there's actually been some news that's come out this week about both of these guys. One, Mario Edwards Jr. might have a decent market in free agency. The Texans are ready to lose out on Mario Edwards Jr. if a team's going to cash in and spend big money on Mario. I really want him to come back to Houston, but if the price isn't right, I could see another team, capitalizing on his big year and giving him a payday. Foley Fatukasi, the news on him actually somewhat benefits the Texans. He's dealing with injuries from this past season. I believe it was a shoulder injury, which might halt his, free agency period, at least to start with teams looking at him. That might help the Texans to look at some of the options they have, and if they don't like any of the options out there in free agency currently or in the NFL draft, they could fall back on a guy like Foley Fatukasi to come back to Houston on a team-friendly deal. Speaking of former Texans, also, Sheldon Rankins has made the rounds this week across Texans Twitter of people saying, could there be a reunion there? The 30-year-old did not play well in his first year at Cincinnati, resulting in him getting released. Could he be an option for the Houston Texans to re-sign? If it's a very cheap deal, I'm okay, but 30 years old, injury plagued, it's okay. I mean, I think the Texans, I'd much rather, if they're looking at defensive tackles, either, go in as a better pass rusher, or I think you need more of that true nose tackle, the guy in the middle who plays right in front of the center. Sheldon Rankins doesn't really give me that vibe. He's more of a pass rushing defensive tackle, in my opinion. A reason why the Texans kind of let him walk, also because Cincinnati gave him a huge payday. Another option, and at the time that I'm filming this, he has not been released, but Jonathan Allen of the Washington Commanders, they've been, shopping him as a possible trade candidate. I don't know if any team takes the bait, but if he is cut, another really intriguing option for the Houston Texans. But an option that I actually like more, because I think teams might overpay a little bit just for the name value of Jonathan Allen, also, a former early round pick. I really like Adam Butler from the Las Vegas Raiders. He's the same age, 30 years old, but look at the production this past year. 65 tackles, 5 sacks, 8 tackles for loss. He was a menace in Las Vegas. Not as sexy as a name as a Jonathan Allen, but look out for Adam Butler. I think he re-signs with the Raiders, but he is another really good option at the defensive tackle spot, in my opinion, if you're looking for somebody to fill some gaps. Another one that has been linked to the Texans, Robertson-Harris. He played for the Jacksonville Jaguars this past season and then was traded mid-year to the Seattle Seahawks. Did not have any production really for Seattle. Has played well before for Jacksonville. 20 tackles, 2 sacks, 4 tackles for loss across both those teams last year. He's 31 years old. A bigger body guy, 6'5", 290. Okay, if he's a cheap option, sure, for the Houston Texans, but I would not want to pay Robertson-Harris anything more than, $3, $4, $5 million a year. I think that might be a little bit too rich for this guy. Another option at defensive tackle, Poona Ford, 29-year-old, played for the LA Chargers this past year, 39 tackles, 3 sacks, 8 tackles for loss. A short and stout guy. Remember how I was just talking about, I think the Texans need to focus more at the nose tackle spot. This is a nose tackle. He's short, he's stout, he's built. He's not going to get moved on the interior of that defensive line. A decent option for the Houston Texans. Another one, a guy who just got cut. He's a little bit on the older side, but Javon Hargrave for the San Francisco 49ers. Remember, he was one of those guys in Philadelphia the first time around whenever they went to the Super Bowl who played amazing for that defensive line, ended up cashing in huge with the San Francisco 49ers. The only problem is he hasn't been able to stay on the field. He's been injured throughout his time in San Francisco. 7 tackles, 1 sack this past season, 1 tackle for loss for Hargrave. A guy, if you're able to get him on the very cheap, could be an intriguing option for the Texans. Could be a really sneaky depth signing for Houston. I don't know how much he has left in the tank or how much those injuries have affected Hargrave, but could be a good option for the Texans. Roy Lopez, also a former Texan, played with the Arizona Cardinals for the past couple of seasons. He's only 27 years old and another guy that I think the Texans should look at if you're trying to, add depth pieces here and there for cheap contract. Roy Lopez, obviously, not going to, fill up the stat sheet, but a bigger body, more of a nose tackle guy. Like I've said, I think that's what the Texans need to focus on more because I think you need to be able to stop the run. You need to be able to plug up the center of that defensive line, and a guy like Roy Lopez could help out this team. Speaking of guys from the Houston Texans, let's look at some edge options and a free agent option at edge for the Houston Texans. Derek Barnett, 28 years old, and really since coming over to Houston, formerly of the Philadelphia Eagles, I believe he was a first-round pick. 28, he's still 28 years old. Last season, maybe one of his best years of his career since the first couple of years in Philly. 26 tackles, 5 sacks, 4 tackles for loss, 2 touchdown returns on fumble recoveries for Barnett this past year. He was a really good option for the Texans as a rotational guy. Whenever Daniil or Will Anderson needed a break, he came in and he really didn't miss that much of a beat for Houston. I think because of his age and how well he played this past year, he could be kind of cashing in free agency for a couple, edge-needy teams this year. But if not, if he's willing to come back to Houston on a decent team-friendly deal, I'd be all in on signing Derek Barnett. And speaking of Derek Barnett, we talked about him. We talked about Foley Fatukasi, Mario Edwards Jr. Let me know. One Texan that you want to re-sign this offseason. Is it one of the guys that I mentioned? Maybe it's Stephon Diggs. Maybe it's another free agent. They already went out and re-signed Dare Ogunbowale as somebody who was on the team this past season. Let me know. One Texans free agent that you want to re-sign. Now, going on with the edge rushers, I don't think this is a target at all for the Houston Texans because they already have Daniil Hunter. Will Anderson Jr. is fantastic, and I don't see them spending big money at the edge spot. But some big news over the past, 48 hours. Joey Bosa released by the Chargers. I mean, when he's healthy, is a top 10 edge rusher in the NFL. I wonder how this affects the market. I wonder, there's a lot of teams that are out there for a Myles Garrett trade. Could they look at an option like Joey Bosa saying, hey, I'd rather just pay Joey Bosa than have to give up draft capital and then also on top of that pay Myles Garrett? This could throw a wrench in a couple people's plans or be a solid option B for a couple teams. Either way, I think that helps the Texans out as they're going to be looking at lower level edge rusher talent, and that kind of brings their market down just a little bit. I think that could help the Houston Texans. Let's look at some more realistic free agent options at edge for the Houston Texans. Matt Judon played this past year with the Atlanta Falcons, 41 tackles, 5.5 sacks, 7 tackles for loss. All these options at edge are going to be rotation guys. You already have your starters. So nobody that I'm mentioning, I think you're going to be like, oh yeah, that's a surefire starter for the Texans. All these guys are going to be rotation guys. And Matt Judon is an older guy, but a really good rotation guys. And we've seen the Texans go down this route before. Jerry Hughes, among others, as older edge rushers on the back end of their careers that come to, try to win a championship or try to do something with a contender like the Houston Texans. A younger option that may be looking to prove himself, Josh Uche from the Kansas City Chiefs. He was actually traded to the Chiefs midseason from the New England Patriots. What do you know? Another connection there with Nick Caserio was part of the, front office that drafted Josh with New England. I mean, hasn't really had a great career in terms of, production wise, but 26-year-old, maybe he wants to, a fresh start with a good D-line in Houston, could be an option as a rotational edge rusher. This might be one of my favorite options for the Houston Texans, Dennis Gardeck. Now, he's played his career with the Arizona Cardinals, and you're like, Jeremy, what are we talking about the Arizona Cardinals for? Well, Texans defensive coordinator Matt Burke was with the Arizona Cardinals before he was with the Houston Texans. And Gardeck is one of those guys who is just a solid rotation guy. He's never going to be like an amazing starter or, a Pro Bowl level guy. But as a rotation guy, he kind of reminds me of, when the Texans, I'm not going to say he was as good as Brooks Reed or Connor Barwin and, the Bulls on Parade guys. But remember how we had those like stable of really good rotation edge rushers during those, early 2010s, late 2000s seasons. I think Gardeck is a really good option as a rotational edge rusher for Houston. Also brings some special teams value, which you'll need in, some of the guys who aren't your starters on this team. Another guy from the Arizona Cardinals, a free agent option at edge. Another younger guy, Baron Browning, was with the Broncos before, but his production has kind of fallen off year over year. Another guy, maybe if he's looking to prove himself on a cheap deal, could come to the Houston Texans and be a rotational edge rusher. And lastly, I'm going to talk about Chauncey Golston. He's only 27 years old for the Dallas Cowboys, and we know the Dallas Cowboys don't have any money to spend at all. They have no pieces of the pie left. Jerry's all out of pie. So maybe Golston is a product of that. He's not able to return to Dallas. The Texans are able to get a steal. I think he's a good, defensive lineman to have on your team because he also gives you kind of that position flexibility similar to DeMeco Autry, where I think you can, line up Golston a little bit on the inside, like 3 technique, shaded on the outside of the guard, can also play defensive end for the Texans. Decent production for the Cowboys last year. 56 tackles, 5.5 sacks, 5 tackles for loss. Would be another option as a rotational edge rusher for the Texans. That's all I have for you on today's video. Folks, if you haven't already, hit me up on social media at Jeremy Chuggs on Twitter. My DMs are always open. And if you haven't already, you made it to the end of the video, why not hit that sub button and join the #1 Texans channel here on YouTube here at Texans Today.